The light was a liar. It fractured through forests of crystal glasses, shattered across the diamond chokers of financiers' wives, and painted the cavernous hall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in a warm, benevolent gold. It promised elegance, culture, and philanthropy. But Belinda Washington, standing near the podium in a midnight blue gown that flowed like liquid shadow, knew the truth. Light, in rooms like this, was just another currency, used to illuminate success and cast the less fortunate into convenient darkness. Tonight, the light was meant for her. At 28, she was the youngest ever head of strategy for Crestwood Equity, and she was moments away from announcing the firm's landmark initiative, the Crestwood Catalyst Fund, a billion-dollar venture aimed at supporting minority and women-led tech startups. It was the culmination of 2 years of relentless work, a project that was not just professionally significant, but deeply personal. It was her answer to a world that had once told her she didn't belong. The murmur of conversation, a soft symphony of rustling silk and clinking ice, quieted as a woman of severe elegance approached the microphone. Catherine Mitchell, CEO of the monolithic Mitchell Capital, host of this evening's gala, and a titan of an industry that had not been built by or for women like her. She was in her late 50s, her silver blonde hair sculpted into a helmet of impenetrable perfection, her smile a thin, precise incision in a face that had been expertly preserved against the ravages of time and emotion. Belinda felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in her stomach. It was the same feeling she'd had 20 years ago, standing on a different kind of polished floor, under a different kind of unforgiving light. "Good evening." Catherine's voice was smooth, cultured, carrying across the hall without the need for excessive volume. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed. "Thank you all for joining us to support the Children's Literacy Fund. It is in the spirit of nurturing potential that I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our next speaker." Catherine's eyes, the pale blue of a winter sky, found Belinda across the room. The smile she offered was for the cameras, for the audience, for the performance of female solidarity. But the look in her eyes was something else entirely. It was an appraisal, a cataloging, a dismissal. "We have with us tonight a truly remarkable young woman," Catherine continued, her tone dripping with a carefully calibrated condescension. "Belinda Washington of Crestwood Equity. Her recent success is a testament to what can be achieved, no matter how challenging one's beginnings." A subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. A few heads turned. Intrigued, Catherine had their full attention. "Some of you may not know," she said, leaning slightly into the microphone, sharing a conspiratorial secret with 1,000 of her closest friends. But Belinda's journey into our world is quite the story. She first walked into the financial sector, quite literally, as a little girl, at a small neighborhood branch of Premier National Bank. Catherine paused, letting the name hang in the air. A bank we at Mitchell Capital later had the privilege of acquiring and, shall we say, reforming. The knot in Belinda's stomach became a shard of ice. Her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, the weight of their curiosity. Catherine delivered the final, perfectly aimed blow. There was a little misunderstanding that day, I'm told. A child's confusion. But it was an incident that clearly lit a fire under her. A fire that has brought her all the way here, to this stage. Please join me in welcoming the incredibly tenacious Belinda Washington. The applause was polite, but it was drowned out by the roar in Belinda's ears. Misunderstanding, confusion. The words were a sanitizing balm on a suppurating wound. The memory, long suppressed under layers of ambition, education, and hard-won success, tore through her with the force of a physical impact. She is 8 years old. The marble floor of the bank is cold, a vast, white desert under her polished school shoes. In her hands, she clutches a unicorn piggy bank, heavy with 3 months of savings, $47.50. Her blue passbook, her name written in her mother's elegant script, feels like a sacred text. She is here to make a deposit. A grown-up errand for a grown-up purpose. A silver locket for her mother's birthday. She is proud. She is responsible. Then, the faces. A circle of them. All white. All hostile. A woman with a tight, cruel mouth, Catherine Mitchell. The manager staring down at her, not as a child, but as an infestation. "Get out. A child like that doesn't belong here." Whispers like sandpaper. Probably stolen. A security guard herding her into the center of the lobby like an animal. The accusation in their eyes. The certainty that her black skin and her presence in their upscale world were crimes in and of themselves. Then, the ultimate humiliation. The call to the police. The terror of a child who believes she has done something wrong, but cannot understand what. The hot, silent tears she refuses to let them see. Now, 20 years later, the faces were different, more sophisticated, their judgment veiled behind polite smiles, but the feeling was identical. The feeling of being assessed, found wanting, and put back in her place. Catherine Mitchell, with a few well-chosen words, had reduced her from a brilliant financial strategist to the poor little black girl from the wrong side of town who had once been mistaken for a thief. She had reframed Belinda's triumph, not as a product of intellect and hard work, but as a reaction to a petty slight, a desperate scramble for approval. Belinda's body went rigid. Her every instinct screamed at her to flee, to hide, to let the rage and shame consume her. But her mother had not raised her to flee. Her mother, Victoria Washington, had raised her to fight. She forced her limbs to move, one foot in front of the other, a slow, deliberate march toward the podium. Her expression remained a mask of serene composure, the one she had perfected over years of navigating rooms where she was the only one. She met Catherine's gaze as she took her place at the microphone, offering a small, unreadable smile. The applause faded. 1,000 pairs of eyes watched her, waiting. "Thank you, Catherine." Belinda's voice was steady, clear, betraying none of the seismic chaos erupting within her. "Thank you for that historical perspective." She let the words settle, a subtle parry to Catherine's thrust. "History is important," Belinda continued, her gaze sweeping across the opulent hall. "It teaches us where we've been. It shows us the foundations upon which our present is built. And sometimes, it reveals cracks in those foundations, cracks that an older generation might have papered over, but that a new generation has a responsibility to repair." She did not look at Catherine again. She didn't need to. The battle had been publicly, if quietly, declared, as she launched into her prepared speech about the Catalyst Fund, about building new futures and empowering overlooked visionaries. Her mind was elsewhere. It was in the cold, calculated space where she did her best work, the space where emotion was refined into fuel, and fury was forged into strategy. Catherine Mitchell thought she had won the opening skirmish. She thought she had reminded a little girl of her place. She had no idea she had just awakened a sleeping giant and, in doing so, signed the death warrant for her entire empire. The city was a tapestry of light thrown across the black velvet of the night. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of her apartment on the 70th floor of a slender new tower overlooking Central Park, the view was an affirmation of power. Each pinprick of light represented a life, a business, a story. From this height, they were all just components in a massive, interconnected system, a system Belinda had learned to navigate, to manipulate, and to master. Her apartment was the antithesis of the gala's suffocating opulence. It was a study in minimalist precision polished concrete floors, stark white walls, furniture chosen for its form and function rather than its comfort. It was less a home than a command center, a sterile, high-tech sanctuary where she could think without distraction. She kicked off her heels, the sharp click of the buckles echoing in the silence. The midnight blue gown, a tool for the evening's performance, felt like a costume she was desperate to shed. She walked to the wet bar, its single slab of black marble gleaming under a recessed light, and poured herself a glass of water, ignoring the collection of expensive single malts. She needed clarity, not numbness. She replayed Catherine's introduction in her mind, dissecting it word by word, inflection by inflection. It had been a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The faux praise, the infantilizing tone, the casual mention of acquiring and reforming the bank, it was all designed to position Catherine as the gracious savior and Belinda as the fortunate charity case. She had weaponized Belinda's trauma, turning it into a charming little anecdote for the ruling class. The rage she had kept so tightly coiled at the gala began to unfurl, a hot, venomous thing in the cool silence of her apartment. It wasn't just about the humiliation. It was about the erasure. Catherine had tried to erase 20 years of discipline, of sacrifice, of intellectual combat. She had tried to erase the summa cum laude from Wharton, the grueling years at Goldman Sachs, the strategic brilliance that had made Crestwood's partners see her not as a diversity hire, but as their sharpest weapon. Belinda set her glass down, the condensation leaving a perfect, fleeting ring on the marble. She walked to her office, a glass-enclosed cube at the far end of the great room, with a tap on her tablet. The transparent walls turned an opaque, milky white, sealing her inside. She sat at her desk, a seamless piece of brushed aluminum, and woke the holographic interface that floated above its surface. With a few gestures in the air, she navigated through layers of encrypted security until she arrived at a single, heavily shielded file. The file was labeled CM Contingency. She had created it 5 years ago, the day she first learned that Mitchell Capital had acquired the regional bank chain that included the long-defunct Premier National. She had known, with a chilling certainty, that her path and Catherine Mitchell's would cross again. Hope was not a strategy. Preparation was. For 5 years, she had been quietly, patiently gathering information, every public filing, every shareholder report, every news article, every whisper of industry gossip about Mitchell Capital had been funneled into this file. It was a skeleton, an outline of a weakness. It was not yet a weapon. Tonight, Catherine had given her the reason to arm it. This was no longer a contingency. It was the primary objective. Her original plan to rise so high that the memory of that day became an insignificant footnote was naive. A woman like Catherine Mitchell would always see her as the little girl on the marble floor. The only way to truly escape that memory was not to outrun it, but to burn it to the ground, and to build something new on its ashes. Her objective crystallized, cold and pure as a diamond. She would not merely defeat Catherine Mitchell. She would not settle for a simple apology or a public retraction. She would dismantle her. She would deconstruct her empire, expose the rotten foundation upon which it was built, and leave her with nothing but the truth of who she was. This was not a quest for revenge. Revenge was messy, emotional. This was a campaign for justice, a meticulous, systematic, and total annihilation. She made her first call. A secure, end-to-end encrypted video link flickered to life, revealing the kind, weathered face of Arthur Vance. He was in his study, a warm, cluttered room filled with books and artifacts from a lifetime of teaching ethics and philosophy at Columbia. He had been her mother's friend and mentor, and after her mother's death 10 years ago, he had become Belinda's staunchest ally and moral compass. "Belinda," he said, his brow furrowed with concern. "I saw the gala broadcast. Are you all right?" Her introduction was unconscionable. "I'm fine, Arthur," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. "In fact, I have a great deal of clarity. The kind of clarity that precedes a storm, I suspect," he said wisely. "The storm is already here," Belinda replied. "I'm just deciding where the lightning will strike. I need your advice." She outlined her intention, not in the heated language of vengeance, but in the cool, detached terminology of a corporate strategist. She spoke of leveraging assets, exploiting vulnerabilities, and engineering a hostile takeover of Catherine Mitchell's life. Arthur listened patiently, his fingers steepled under his chin. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "What Catherine did tonight was a profound act of violence. Disguised as a social nicety," he began, his voice low and serious. "Your anger is righteous. But I must ask you the question your mother and I debated many times, justice, Belinda, or vengeance. They start on the same road, but they end in very different places. One seeks to restore balance. The other seeks only to create a mirror image of the pain it has suffered. And what if, in this case, they are one and the same?" Belinda challenged. "What if the only way to restore balance is to remove the source of the imbalance permanently?" "Permanently is a very long time," Arthur cautioned. "Be careful that in the process of destroying a monster, you do not become one yourself. Your mother walked that line her entire life. It is a razor's edge." "I'm not my mother," Belinda said, a touch too sharply. "No, you are not," Arthur agreed softly. "But her legacy is a part of you. Be certain you are acting in service of your own future, not in service of her past." The call ended, leaving Belinda alone once more in her sterile cocoon. Arthur's words were a necessary check, a reminder of the stakes. But they did not change her resolve. They only refined it. She would not be a monster. She would be a surgeon. And she would excise the cancer that was Catherine Mitchell from the world of finance with clinical precision. Her hands moved through the air, commands flowing from her mind to the holographic interface. She began to build the framework of her plan, a complex architecture of finance, data, and human psychology. The first step was to find the cracks in Catherine's foundation. And for that, she needed an expert in demolition. She typed a name into a secure messaging app, a name she hadn't contacted in years, but one she knew would remember that day at the bank with a clarity that rivaled her own. "Jessica Chen." The message was brief and to the point. "I need to talk to you. It's about Premier National Bank. It's about Catherine Mitchell." She sent the message and leaned back in her chair. The city lights outside seemed to sharpen, to align themselves with her purpose. The game had begun. Catherine Mitchell's power was an octopus, its tentacles reaching into every corner of New York's financial, political, and social ecosystems. She sat on the boards of museums and universities, her donations buying her not just influence, but a veneer of unimpeachable civic virtue. Her firm managed the personal wealth of senators and the endowments of Ivy League colleges. To move against her directly was to invite swift and overwhelming retaliation. Belinda knew her first moves had to be subtle, untraceable, like a poison that works its way through the system before the first symptom appears. Her initial gambit was a test. Crestwood Equity was in the final stages of a strategic merger with a Swiss private bank. a deal that would give them a powerful foothold in the European market. Belinda had architected the deal. She deliberately leaked a minor, positive detail about the merger to a trusted contact at Bloomberg. Within 24 hours, the Wall Street Journal ran a front-page story on the deal, but the angle was poisonous. The anonymous sources in the article painted Belinda as a recklessly aggressive strategist, a wunderkind whose ambition outstripped her experience. It hinted at a troubled background that made her a high-risk factor in such a delicate international negotiation. The language was coded, but the message was clear. The Swiss, famously risk-averse, began to get cold feet. Calls were made. Meetings were postponed. The deal, which had been a certainty, was now on life support. Belinda felt the attack like a physical blow, but she also felt a grim satisfaction. Catherine hadn't even bothered to hide her hand. She was demonstrating the length of her reach, showing Belinda how easily she could suffocate her career. It was the first obstacle, and it was a formidable one. She needed an ally, someone who could navigate the shadows. Jessica Chen agreed to meet at a small, anonymous coffee shop in a corner of the city neither of them frequented. 20 years had changed her. The idealistic young bank teller was gone, replaced by a woman in her mid-40s, with weary eyes and a cynical set to her mouth. She was a forensic accountant now, a partner at a mid-tier firm, spending her days sifting through the digital debris of corporate malfeasance. The work paid well, but it had hollowed her out. "I almost didn't come," Jessica admitted, stirring her black coffee with a plastic stick. "That day, I've spent 20 years trying to forget it. The way I just stood there, the way she threatened me, and I just backed down." "You tried to help," Belinda said, her voice soft. "You were the only one." "Trying isn't doing," Jessica countered, her gaze sharp. "I chose my job over a terrified little girl. There's no honor in that." "So why are you here?" "Belinda, why dig this up now?" Belinda didn't waste time with pleasantries. She told Jessica about the gala, about Catherine's calculated public humiliation. She laid out her intention not for revenge, but for a reckoning. Catherine Mitchell built her career on a foundation of prejudice and cruelty. Belinda said, "She used her power to crush anyone she deemed beneath her. You and I were just the first people she stepped on. I want to find out how many others there are. I want to find the financial crimes that are always hidden behind that kind of moral rot." "You're talking about taking on Mitchell Capital," Jessica said, a humorless laugh escaping her lips. "That's not a company. It's a fortress. Her lawyers have lawyers. Her books are scrubbed so clean they squeak." "Every fortress has a crack," Belinda insisted. "Every crime leaves a trace. You're the best at finding those traces. I'm not asking you to do anything illegal. I'm not asking you to hack her servers. I'm asking you to look at the public record, at the patterns, at the deals she's made over the past 2 decades. Find the one that doesn't make sense. Find the loose thread, and I'll pull it." She saw a flicker of the old fire in Jessica's tired eyes. It was a chance at redemption, a chance to finally do what she hadn't had the courage to do 20 years ago. "This would be off the books," Jessica said, her voice dropping. "I'd have to use my own time, my own resources. It would be dangerous. If she found out, she'd destroy my career." "I will protect you," Belinda promised, "and I will pay you double your current partner's draw for your time." The offer of money was a necessity, but the real hook was the chance to balance the scales. Jessica was in. For the next several weeks, they operated like a covert intelligence unit. Belinda fed Jessica terabytes of public data on Mitchell Capital's acquisitions, investments, and charitable contributions. Jessica, working late into the night from her home office, began to build a map of Catherine Mitchell's financial empire. At first, it was, as Jessica had predicted, a fortress. Every transaction was clean, every filing meticulous. But Jessica was looking for patterns, for the ghost in the machine. She noticed that Mitchell Capital had a peculiar affinity for acquiring struggling companies in marginalized communities. They would buy them for pennies on the dollar, load them with debt, strip them of their assets, and then sell off the hollowed-out shell, all while issuing press releases about urban renewal and community investment. It was predatory, but it was brutally, legally efficient. It was a macro version of the prejudice Catherine had shown in the bank all those years ago, seeing people and their communities not as things to be nurtured, but as resources to be exploited. This was immoral, but it wasn't illegal. It wasn't the silver bullet Belinda needed. While Jessica dug, Belinda fought a defensive war. She worked tirelessly to save the Swiss merger, calling in every favor she had, using her own network of contacts in Europe to counteract the poison Catherine was spreading. She spent hours on calls with Arthur Vance, who served as her sounding board, constantly challenging her motives and forcing her to refine her strategy, to ensure it was aimed at justice, not just destruction. "She's goading you, Belinda," Arthur warned during one late-night call. "She wants you to make a reckless move, to overplay your hand. She is counting on you to be driven by the same blind rage that drives her." Arthur's words were a grounding force. Belinda recalibrated. She needed an inside source. Through careful research, Jessica identified a junior analyst at Mitchell Capital named David Chen. No relation. He was brilliant, ambitious, and his social media footprint suggested a deep disillusionment with the corporate world. He was also a member of an online forum for whistleblowers that Jessica had been monitoring. Belinda engineered a chance encounter at an industry conference. She didn't approach him with a cloak-and-dagger proposition. She simply spoke to him as a peer, listening to his frustrations with the soul-crushing culture at Mitchell Capital, a place where ethics were a footnote in the compliance manual. She offered him a potential future at Crestwood, an escape route. She planted a seed. 2 weeks later, David sent her an encrypted message. It contained a single internal document, a preliminary due diligence report for a series of obscure shell corporations Catherine's firm had used in its earliest days. It was the break they needed. Jessica dove into the files. Most of the shell corporations had bland, generic names: Apex Holdings, Summit Investments. But one stood out. It was named Elm Street Holdings. The name was too specific, too personal. It felt like a clue. "It's a needle in a haystack," Jessica told Belinda over a secure line, her voice tight with a mixture of frustration and excitement. "But it feels important. Why Elm Street? It has to mean something to her." Belinda felt a shiver of anticipation. This was it, the loose thread. She authorized Jessica to use a discreet private investigator, a former SEC agent known for his ability to dig up buried histories, to find the origin of that name. As the investigator began his work, Catherine escalated her attacks. A formal ethics complaint was filed against Belinda at Crestwood, alleging she had tried to poach an employee from a rival firm. It was baseless, but it triggered an internal review, bogging Belinda down in meetings with lawyers and HR, distracting her, draining her energy. Catherine was tightening the noose. The pressure was immense. Belinda knew they were in a race against time. She had to find the source of Catherine's rot before Catherine succeeded in burying her completely. The answer, she felt with every fiber of her being, was waiting at the end of a road called Elm Street. The call from Jessica came at 2 a.m. Belinda was asleep, but it was the shallow, restless sleep of a soldier on the front lines. She answered on the first ring. I found it. Jessica's voice was a strained whisper, imbued with a gravity that made the hairs on Belinda's arms stand on end. I found Elm Street. Belinda was instantly awake, her mind sharp and clear. Where? It's not a what, it's a where. A town you've never heard of. Oakhaven, Pennsylvania. The heart of the Rust Belt. Or what's left of it. Jessica took a ragged breath. Belinda. This changes everything. Jessica sent the secured file. Belinda opened it on the large screen in her living room, the city lights below seeming to dim in comparison to the stark black and white of the documents that filled the display. They were old newspaper articles, scanned from microfiche, the text slightly blurred, ghosts from a past Belinda never knew existed. The headline from a 1993 edition of the Oakhaven Daily Chronicle hit her like a physical blow. Mitchell Steel shutters gates after hostile takeover. Thousands face unemployment. The article detailed the swift, brutal acquisition of the town's largest employer by a then-ascendant, famously aggressive private equity firm from New York, a firm that had made its name taking over what it called inefficient, legacy industries, and restructuring them for maximum profit. The name of the firm was Washington Financial Group. It was led by its young, brilliant, and utterly ruthless founder, Victoria Washington, Belinda's mother. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She scanned the article, her eyes devouring the words. It described the devastation the takeover had wrought on the small, one-industry town. The plant, Mitchell Steel, wasn't just a business, it was the town's lifeblood. The owner, a man named Robert Mitchell, was a third-generation steel man, beloved in the community. He had fought the takeover with everything he had, but he was no match for the financial weaponry of Victoria Washington. The article included a grainy photo of him, a proud, broad-shouldered man, his face etched with disbelief and despair. His factory was located at 141 Elm Street. A second article, dated 6 months later, was a brief, tragic postscript. Former steel magnate Robert Mitchell dead at 54. He had died of a massive coronary event. The unofficial cause of death, according to the townspeople quoted in the story, was a broken heart. He left behind a wife and a teenage daughter. A daughter named Catherine. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a coffin lid closing. The room felt airless. Belinda sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The gala. The bank. It was never about race. Not entirely. That was just the language Catherine had used. The weapon that was most readily available to her that day. The true source of her hatred was deeper, more personal. A festering wound 20 years old. When 8-year-old Belinda Washington had walked into Premier National Bank, holding a passbook with her name on it, Catherine Mitchell hadn't seen a little black girl. She had seen the daughter of the woman who had destroyed her father, her family, her entire world. She had seen a ghost, and she had seized the first opportunity she ever had to exact a small measure of revenge on the Washington dynasty. Belinda's quest, which had felt so righteous, so clear, was suddenly drowning in a sea of moral ambiguity. Her entire life, her education, her wealth, the very apartment she was sitting in, was built on the foundation of her mother's victory. A victory that had resulted in the utter ruin of Catherine's family. The $47.50 in her piggy bank that day had been an infinitesimal fraction of a fortune built on the ashes of Oakhaven, Pennsylvania. She looked at the photo of Robert Mitchell again, and, for the first time, she felt a sliver of something other than animosity for his daughter. She felt a chilling sense of recognition. Catherine's life had been defined by a single, cataclysmic event, just as Belinda's had been shaped by the memory of that cold, marble floor. They were two sides of the same coin. Two women whose lives were inextricably linked by the actions of a mother, one revered and the other despised. The villain of her story was no longer a simple racist caricature. She was a woman forged in tragedy, driven by a vendetta that had simmered for 2 decades. Catherine wasn't just cruel, she was wounded, and her entire life had been a meticulously planned campaign to amass enough power to hurt the family that had hurt her. Belinda felt a wave of nausea. She thought of her mother, Victoria, a force of nature, a brilliant, trailblazing black woman who had conquered the white, male world of finance through sheer force of will. To Belinda, she had been a hero, a protector, the woman who had descended upon that bank like a goddess of vengeance to defend her child. But this new information painted a different picture. It showed a predator, a corporate raider who had seen a town's livelihood as nothing more than an undervalued asset on a balance sheet. The conflict was no longer a simple matter of good versus evil. It had become a Greek tragedy, a story of generational sins and inherited grievances. To destroy Catherine now felt less like justice, and more like perpetuating a cycle of destruction that her own mother had started. She called Arthur Vance, her voice hollow. She explained what she had found. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "This is a heavy burden, Belinda," he finally said. "The knowledge that your family's prosperity is tied to another's pain." "What do I do?" "Arthur," she pleaded, the cool composure of the strategist finally cracking, revealing the confused woman beneath. "If I continue, it's not justice anymore. It's just finishing a war my mother started. If I stop, I let Catherine get away with everything she's done to me, to Jessica, to countless others." "Perhaps the goal is no longer to win the war," Arthur said gently. "Perhaps the goal is to end it. Your mother made her choices, and Catherine is making hers. Now, you must make yours. Will you be defined by their battle, or will you choose to define yourself?" Belinda hung up the phone, the question echoing in the silent room. The path forward was no longer clear. The moral high ground had crumbled away beneath her feet, leaving her standing on a precipice. The rage that had fueled her was now complicated by a profound sense of sorrow and a terrible, shared history. Catherine Mitchell was still her enemy, but she was no longer her opposite. She was her shadow, and Belinda knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the next move in this deadly game would define them both. The revelation of their shared history did not bring a truce. It ignited an inferno. Catherine, through her own network of corporate intelligence, must have detected the inquiries into her past, the digital fingerprints left by the investigator in the archives of Oakhaven. She now understood that Belinda knew the truth, and she retaliated not with the subtle poison of rumor, but with the brute force of a cornered animal. The attack came for Jessica first. One morning, Jessica arrived at her office to find 2 men in dark suits waiting for her. They were from the district attorney's office, accompanied by legal counsel from Mitchell Capital. They presented her with a subpoena and informed her she was the subject of a criminal investigation into corporate espionage and wire fraud. Catherine had manufactured a digital trail, a series of spoofed emails and falsified server logs. That made it appear as though Jessica had used her firm's resources to illegally access Mitchell Capital's proprietary data. Jessica's partners, terrified of being dragged into a legal war with a financial behemoth, suspended her immediately. Pending the outcome of the investigation, her career, her reputation, and her freedom were suddenly on the line. She was facing ruin. The next blow was aimed at Arthur Vance. A major anonymous donation to Columbia University was abruptly rescinded. with a note to the Board of Trustees expressing deep concern over the radical, anti-capitalist rhetoric of certain tenured professors. The note specifically cited Arthur's name and his published works on corporate ethics as one of the university's largest donors. Catherine's implication was clear: get rid of Arthur, or the funding disappears. The university launched a formal review of his tenure, a humiliating and career-threatening process designed to bury him in bureaucracy and doubt. This was Catherine's true nature revealed. The polite, passive-aggressive mask was gone, replaced by a vicious, unrestrained cruelty. She wasn't just trying to win. She was trying to scorch the earth around Belinda, to isolate her by destroying everyone she cared about. It was a clear message. You took my family. I will take yours. Belinda felt a cold, terrifying fury, unlike anything she had ever known. This was no longer a strategic game. It was a fight for survival. She poured her resources into defending her allies, hiring the best legal team in the city for Jessica and a powerhouse academic freedom advocate for Arthur. But she knew that a defensive strategy would only lead to a slow, grinding defeat. She had one chance to end it. One public, high-stakes forum where the truth could not be buried by lawyers or threats. The Mitchell Capital annual shareholder meeting was in 1 week. It would be held in the grand ballroom of the New York Hilton, a cavernous, impersonal space filled with investors, analysts, and the international financial press. The entire event would be live-streamed globally. It was Catherine's stage, the place where she annually cemented her image as a brilliant and benevolent leader. It was the perfect place to tear that image down. The final week was a blur of frantic, sleepless preparation, working with Jessica's legal team. Belinda assembled her evidence. David, her source inside Mitchell Capital, risked everything by feeding her more internal documents, proof of the predatory lending schemes, memos detailing the firm's toxic, discriminatory culture, and internal audits that hinted at financial irregularities. Belinda and Jessica worked side by side in a secure hotel suite, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of righteous desperation. They cross-referenced every data point, built unassailable timelines, and prepared a presentation that would be both a legal indictment and a moral condemnation. But Belinda knew that simply exposing Catherine's corporate crimes wasn't enough. That would only be half the story. To end the cycle, she had to expose its origin. She had to talk about Oakhaven. She had to talk about her mother. The day of the shareholder meeting. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of money and nervous energy. A massive screen loomed over the stage, displaying the crisp, blue Mitchell Capital logo. The room was a sea of dark suits. Flashing cameras from the press pit created a constant, nervous stutter of light. Catherine Mitchell stood at the podium, the picture of calm authority. She delivered a glowing report on the firm's quarterly earnings, her voice smooth and confident. She was in her element, the queen in her court. When she opened the floor for questions, Belinda was ready. She had used a series of proxy votes from a small activist shareholder group she had secretly funded to secure a spot at a floor microphone. When her turn came, she stepped forward, the spotlight finding her, making her the focal point of 1,000 pairs of eyes. Belinda Washington, representing the North Star Integrity Fund, she said, her voice clear and steady, echoing through the vast room. On stage, Catherine's polite smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Her eyes were chips of ice. Miss Washington, an unexpected pleasure. I have a question about the long-term ethical liabilities of Mitchell Capital's investment strategy, Belinda began. She didn't wait for an answer. She began her presentation, a verbal blitzkrieg supported by a cascade of documents and charts that her team projected onto the massive screen behind Catherine. She laid bare the predatory lending, using maps to show how the firm systematically targeted minority-owned businesses in vulnerable neighborhoods. She displayed anonymous, redacted testimonials from former employees, including David, describing a culture of fear and discrimination. The room began to murmur. Board members on the stage shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Catherine attempted to parry, dismissing the claims as unsubstantiated allegations from a disgruntled competitor. But Belinda was just getting started. But this strategy of profiting from misfortune isn't new, is it? Belinda's voice dropped, becoming more personal, more pointed. It's a pattern that goes back decades. It's a legacy that began in a small town in Pennsylvania, a town called Oakhaven. A gasp rippled through the room. On the screen, the Mitchell Capital logo was replaced by the grainy, black and white headline from the Oakhaven Daily Chronicle, a photograph of a younger Catherine, standing beside her devastated father, filled the screen. Catherine froze. The color drained from her face. Her composure, her life's work, shattered in an instant for the entire world to see. This was never just about financial returns. Was it? Belinda pressed on, her voice resonating with a sorrowful power. This was about avenging what happened on Elm Street. This was about recreating the pain you felt. My mother, Victoria Washington, led the takeover that destroyed your father's company. It was a ruthless act, and it ruined him. I will not deny that truth. She had the room in the palm of her hand. The press was in a frenzy, but she wasn't finished. She had one last piece of evidence, the one that would change the narrative from a simple takedown to something far more complex. My mother was ruthless, Belinda repeated, her voice softening. But what you never knew, what she never told anyone, is that she was also filled with guilt. The image on the screen changed again. It now showed scanned copies of complex legal documents, trust fund charters, and bank transfers, all meticulously authenticated by Jessica's team. For 20 years, from the time of your father's death until her own, my mother anonymously funded your family's life. She paid for your mother's home. She paid for your education at Wharton, the fortune she took with one hand. She used to secretly rebuild your life with the other. A collective, audible shock went through the ballroom. Catherine stared at the screen, her eyes wide with disbelief, her entire life's narrative collapsing around her. Her burning hatred, her righteous quest for vengeance, it had all been fueled by an engine of grief. But it had been unknowingly paid for by an engine of guilt. She was not the self-made avenger she thought she was. She was the unknowing beneficiary of her enemy's remorse. Belinda looked directly at the broken woman on the stage. There was no triumph in her gaze, only a deep, profound sadness. The destruction between our families ends today, Belinda said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. She turned her attention to the stunned board of directors. The question for this board is no longer just about removing a CEO who has engaged in unethical and illegal practices. The question is what you will build in her place. Another monument to greed or something better. She said nothing more. She simply stepped away from the microphone and watched as the foundations of Catherine Mitchell's world, and her own, settled into a new, uncertain reality. The aftermath was a maelstrom. The live-streamed implosion of Catherine Mitchell became the biggest story in the financial world. Within the hour, the board of Mitchell Capital had voted to remove her as CEO and launch a full-scale independent investigation. The SEC and the New York Attorney General's office announced their own probes the following morning. The fortress had fallen. Belinda watched the initial chaos from the quiet of her apartment. The television muted, the flashing headlines playing out like a silent film. There was no elation, no thrill of victory, only the hollow, ringing exhaustion that follows a long and brutal war. She had won, but the cost had been immense, and the victory was tainted by the sorrow of its origins. The first loose end she tied up was for Jessica, with the evidence of Catherine's conspiracy to frame her made public. The district attorney's office dropped the investigation within days, issuing a formal apology, vindicated and emboldened. Jessica resigned from her partnership. A week later, she accepted a high-level position as the head of a new forensic accounting division at the SEC, the very body now investigating Mitchell Capital. She had found her purpose, not in punishing the guilty, but in protecting the innocent. "You gave me back my courage, Belinda," Jessica told her over coffee, the weariness in her eyes finally replaced by a steely resolve. "You reminded me of the person I wanted to be 20 years ago." Arthur, too, was safe. The tenure review at Columbia was unceremoniously canceled as the university's board, horrified by their association with the disgraced Catherine Mitchell, scrambled to distance themselves. Arthur called Belinda not to thank her, but to check on her. "How does peace feel, my dear?" he asked. "Quiet," she had answered honestly, "and complicated." The most difficult conversation was the one she had with a ghost. She drove out of the city one crisp autumn afternoon, to the cemetery where her mother was buried. Victoria Washington's headstone was simple, elegant black granite, bearing only her name and the dates of her life, a life that now seemed so much more complex to Belinda. She stood before the stone for a long time, the wind rustling the yellow leaves in the trees above. "You were a warrior, Mom," she whispered to the silent stone. "You fought your way through a world that was built to keep you out. You did what you thought you had to do to win. For you. For me? I understand that now. But the battles you fought left scars on other people, on Catherine, on her family. That's your legacy, too." She laid a single white rose on the grave. "I have to build a different one," she said. "A legacy that isn't about winning or losing. A legacy that's about repairing." In the months that followed, she did just that. She was offered the CEO position at the restructured Mitchell Capital, a chance to sit on the throne of her defeated enemy. She turned it down. Instead, she worked with the board and federal regulators to orchestrate a radical resolution. The firm was not sold to another corporate raider. It was broken up. Its viable assets were used to create a new, employee-owned investment cooperative. A significant portion of its capital, billions of dollars, was placed into a trust fund designed to pay reparations to the communities and businesses that had been harmed by its predatory practices over the years. With her own fortune and the notoriety she had gained from the takedown, Belinda established a new foundation. She named it, in a final, symbolic act of breaking the cycle, the Washington Mitchell Foundation for Ethical Enterprise. Its mission was to provide capital and mentorship to entrepreneurs from marginalized communities, and to fund university programs dedicated to teaching corporate ethics. It was an institution designed to prevent future Victorias and Catherines from ever needing to exist. A year after the shareholder meeting, Belinda found herself standing on a familiar sidewalk. She was outside the building that had once been Premier National Bank. The stately old facade was the same, but the polished brass sign beside the door was new. It read, "The Washington Mitchell Community Business Incubator, a project of the W.M. Foundation." It was the Foundation's first major project, a center that provided office space, funding, and legal support for startups from the surrounding neighborhood. The cold, sterile temple of finance where she had been humiliated had been reborn as a place of creation and opportunity. As she stood there, the heavy glass doors opened. A young mother walked out, holding the hand of her daughter, who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. The little girl was clutching a small, brightly colored box, her face alight with pride. She looked at Belinda, a stranger on the sidewalk, and gave her a shy, gap-toothed smile. Belinda felt the last of the icy knot in her stomach, the one that had been there for 20 years, finally dissolve. She smiled back, a genuine, unburdened smile, full of a light that was honest and true. The cycle was broken. The war was over. She hadn't just won. She had built the peace.